All right, here we go with section 3. The most significant challenge to 1950s complacency was the greatest citizens' movement of the 20th century, the Black struggle for equality. The civil rights movement, though celebrated today, was at the time a great surprise. The causes today seem apparent, from World War II's destabilization of the racial system and the mass migration out of the South that made black voters a larger part of the Democratic coalition, to the Cold War and the rise of the independent Third World, both of which exposed the gap between U.S. rhetoric and realities. But few predicted that a mass movement for civil rights would develop in the South. Some thought that a movement might emerge in the North, but there, blacks' allies and black groups had been damaged by McCarthyism and limited by the racism of union leaders and the exclusively legal strategy of the NAACP. The Southern movement instead had its basis in the Southern Black Church, which organized a militant but nonviolent assault on segregation. In the 1950s, the U.S. was still a segregated and unequal society. Half of America's black families lived in poverty. Because of seniority rules that protected white workers in the industrial workforce, blacks lost their jobs first when the economy soured. In the South, Jim Crow characterized all kinds of separate public institutions, and in the North and West, not law, but rather custom barred blacks from colleges, hotels, restaurants, and most suburban housing. In 1950, 17 southern and border states and Washington, D.C. required the racial segregation of public schools, and several more states allowed districts to segregate. Few whites felt it was urgent to challenge racial inequality. With the defeat of Truman's Civil Rights Initiative and the Eisenhower administration's reluctance to confront race relations, segregation was attacked first in the courts. The California challenge to segregation, led by the League of Latin American Citizens, led to the desegregation of public schools in that state in 1946. The governor who signed in that statute in 1946 was Earl Warren, had presided over Japanese American internment, but after the war, he came to oppose racial inequality. In 1953, Eisenhower appointed Warren Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, continued its campaign of legal challenges to the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. By 1950, Supreme Court rulings in several cases suggested that segregation or segregated institutions of higher education for blacks were not actually equal to those open only to whites. In 1950, the Supreme Court unanimously ordered the University of Texas Law School to admit Herman Sweat, despite there being a black law school in the state. There was no way that school could be considered equal, however, to the prestigious white institution. Marshall soon directly attacked racial segregation in public education. The NAACP worked on several cases challenging the unequal treatment of black children in schools across the country. In 1952, 5 of these cases were combined into a single appeal whose title was the first case listed, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In this case, Marshall attacked not the unfair application of the separate but equal doctrine, but the doctrine itself. He argued that even with the same funding and facilities, segregation was unequal treatment because it stigmatized one group of citizens as unfit to associate with the others. Using psychological studies, Marshall stated that children that segregation undermined their self-esteem of black children. Eisenhower, the administration, in a brief of the case, urged the court to recognize the damage segregation inflicted on America's reputation abroad in the context of the Cold War. The new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, read the unanimous decision on May 17, 1954, which stated that segregation in public education violated the equal protection of the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, thus striking down the separate but equal doctrine protecting segregation. Although hailed by the black press as a second Emancipation Proclamation, the decision did not outlaw segregation in institutions other than public schools or ban racial classification in the law. It did not address de facto school segregation in the North based on residential segregation rather than state law. It did not order immediate implementation, but only hearings on how segregated schools should be abolished. But the Warren Court, as an active agent of social change, did give hope to many that segregation would soon end. The Brown decision animated civil rights activists who, after being rather dormant in the early 1950s, now believed that federal courts would back them. Mass action against Jim Crow developed quickly. In December 1955, Rosa Parks, a black department store worker in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to surrender her seat on a city bus to a white rider, as local law required. Parks' arrest provoked the year-long Montgomery bus boycott, which initiated the mass phase of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Within a decade, the Civil Rights Revolution overthrew legal segregation and regained the right to vote for black Southerners. While Parks was depicted as an ordinary woman fed up with Jim Crow, in fact, she was a veteran of the civil rights struggles. In the 1930s, she protested the conviction of the Scottsboro Boys, and in the 1940s, she became one of the few blacks in Montgomery able to cast a ballot after passing a difficult literacy test. In 1954, she attended a training session for political activists at the Highlander School in Tennessee. When news of her arrest spread throughout Montgomery, hundreds of blacks gathered in a local church and refused to ride the bus until they received equal treatment. For more than a year, despite harassment and violence, Montgomery blacks maintained the boycott. In November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation in public transportation unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott launched a nonviolent movement for racial justice based in the South's black churches. It was supported by Northern liberals and focused unprecedented international attention on U.S. racial policies. Through the boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor at a local Baptist church, became the movement's symbol. At the boycott's first protest meeting, King inspired his audience when he said that Southern blacks were tired of going through the long night of captivity and were reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. From its beginning, the language of freedom marked the black movement. Freedom meant many different things, but most of all, it meant political rights and the economic opportunities long denied because of skin color. King's rhetoric united ideas of freedom into a coherent whole. His most famous speech, I Have a Dream, given in 1963, began by noting the unfulfilled promise of emancipation and closed by invoking a cry from a black spiritual. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. King appealed both to blacks' sense of injustice and to the conscience of white Americans by making the case for black rights in terms that united blacks' experience with that of the nation. A student of nonviolent civil disobedience, as proposed by Henry David Thoreau and Gandhi, King offered a philosophy of struggle in which evil was met with good, hate with Christian love, and violence with peaceful demands for change. His Christian themes came from the black church, and they resonated in the black community and America. He appealed to white America by emphasizing blacks' loyalty to the nation and their devotions to its redemptive values. In 1956, building on success in Montgomery, King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a coalition of black ministers and civil rights activists to organize desegregation efforts. But the fact that Montgomery's officials agreed to desegregate only when forced to by a Supreme Court ruling showed that more than local action was necessary to end Jim Crow. The white South's refusal to accept the Brown decision showed that blacks would win their constitutional rights only by federal intervention. But the federal government did not step into the breach. Southern whites did, launching a campaign of massive resistance against desegregation in the South. In 1956, a full 82 of 106 Southern members of Congress signed a Southern manifesto condemning Brown as an abuse of judicial power and calling for lawful resistance to forced integration. Southern states soon passed laws to block desegregation, and some even outlawed the NAACP. Virginia was the first state to enact desegregation, but offered funds to white students, but not blacks, to attend private schools. Some localities shut down their schools entirely rather than desegregate, like Prince Edward County, Virginia, whose public schools remained closed from 1959 until 1964. As a symbol of defiance, Georgia added the Confederate battle flag to its state's flag in 1956, and Alabama and South Carolina began flying the flag over their state capitol buildings. The federal government tried to stay uninvolved. In 1957, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson led successful efforts in Congress to pass the first national civil rights law since Reconstruction, focusing on black voters' rights in the South, but it had weak enforcement and little effect. President Eisenhower offered no moral leadership and called only for Americans to obey the law, while he publicly made it clear that he did not welcome civil rights agitation. In 1957, when Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas used the National Guard to prevent the court-ordered integration of Little Rock Central High School, Eisenhower dispatched federal troops to the city to enforce it. Eisenhower, the federal government, did little to hasten desegregation, and when Eisenhower left office, fewer than 2% of black students attended desegregated schools in the South. Since the Cold War's beginnings, U.S. leaders had worried that segregation tarnished America's reputation abroad. This continued in the late 1950s. Moreover, foreign nations and colonies also noticed the development of civil rights in America. Across the world, people of African descent celebrated the Brown decision, but the slow pace of change led to embarrassing criticisms of American diplomats. So that's our third section. We'll be back with the fourth.